Great. Thank you again for joining us for the second session of our annual energy conference, Petro Diplomacy. I wanted to again thank Kate Dorian, Michael Cohen, Christoph Ruhl, and Herman Wang for being with us earlier. We appreciate your time and the insights that you have shared with our audience. And now we want to turn to the second session for today, titled A Dash for Gas, But Will It Last? I will introduce the panel very briefly here, starting with Anne-Sophie Corbeau, a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Her research focuses on hydrogen and natural gas. She has over 20 years of experience in the energy industry and is a recognized expert on natural gas. She is the author of many publications focusing on gas, liquefied natural gas, markets, Asia, China, India, and Africa, including the book LNG Markets and Transition, The Great Reconfiguration. Previously, she was a senior leader and head of gas analysis at BP. Before joining BP, she was a research fellow at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where she set up and expanded the natural gas program. I'd also like to welcome Jamie Ingram, the senior editor at MEES, where he is responsible for producing content on energy and political developments in the Gulf region and covering global market developments. Prior to joining MEES in 2015, he worked as a MENA analyst at IHS and as a Gulf researcher at RUSI. He has extensive experience working and traveling in the Middle East and has conducted in-depth interviews with many of the most senior energy officials in the region. Last and not least is our good friend Robin Mills. He is a non-resident fellow at AGSIW and the CEO of Qamar Energy. He is an expert on energy strategy and economics and has led major consulting assignments for the EU in Iraq and for a variety of international oil companies on Middle East business development, integrated gas and power generation, and renewable energy. He previously worked for Shell and with Dubai Holding and the Emirates National Oil Company. He is a fellow at Columbia University and a senior fellow at the Iraq Energy Institute and a columnist on energy and environment for The National and Bloomberg. I'm also delighted to welcome our moderator for this session, Colby Connelly, a very good friend of AGSIW, who is a senior research analyst at Energy Intelligence. His research focuses on regional macroeconomics, operating conditions, and political trends in the Middle East and North Africa, including oil markets, OPEC+, geopolitics, and the regional effects of the energy transition. Prior to joining Energy Intelligence, he worked here with us as a research associate at AGSIW, where he focused on the economies of the GCC region with special attention to national oil companies and domestic energy markets. And with that, Colby, over to you.
Thank you for your patience there. Thank you to Raymond as well for those introductions, and to AGSIW for getting us together today to discuss something that I would say is very timely, and it is, but I also think we could have said that last year, and I know we will be able to say that at this time next year as well. So I'm delighted that we're all here to keep this discussion going today. We're centrally dealing with how much momentum this current supply tightness we're experiencing will continue to drive this interest in new supply, as well as those implications that it'll have for some long-term gas demand in Europe and beyond. That is a gross oversimplification of this topic, but it's very complex, and we've got about 90 minutes to deal with it. The last session we had dealt primarily with oil, and we've got some fundamental differences between oil and natural gas, not just as commodities, but really as physical substances in general that bring a different set of complications to trying to really rewire global trade flows in a lot of the ways that we're seeing now. And there certainly are some early signs of a lot of things starting to change. It probably bears mentioning today that as of, I think, next week, Europe will be getting its first LNG cargo from the UAE in a period of about a decade. So, in the run-up to this conversation, we've seen corporate and national leadership looking around the globe for new supply, and in the region, that's turned attention to some of the more obvious candidates like Qatar and Algeria, but also to some more complex operating environments like the Eastern Mediterranean, where there's an enormous amount of both political and commercial work that has to be done, and as well as some pretty vigorous debate on the best ways to get gas out of the region, and to some even perhaps more difficult operating environments as well, like Iraqi Kurdistan, which I certainly won't say anything about because I'm sure that may come up on our panel, and definitely want to point everyone in the direction of the recent paper that AGSIW published on that topic. Definitely recommended reading. It also, I think, outside of the bigger market picture, probably bears some discussion of where regional demand in the Gulf is going out to 2025 and beyond with respect to gas. High energy prices right now are going to fuel a lot of economic growth in the region. With that will come more energy demand. And so in keeping with the theme of energy security, it bears discussing what that picture looks like both for these countries that are producers and how that may impact their status as suppliers in the long term as well. There's a lot to cover here, a lot on probably some European policy as well. All told, we're definitely dealing with a very complicated situation that continues to evolve by the day. So I definitely want to thank everyone for joining us and trying to come as close as possible to hitting what's definitely a moving target. But I want to say as little as possible and hand it over to the panel here. So Robin, maybe I can start with you if you just like to maybe open with your house view on where we are and where we're headed out to 2025.
Well, we're dealing with an unprecedented crisis, as we know here. Don't think I need to reiterate that too much. It's all pretty familiar, but it is a multi-sector and multifaceted energy crisis. But really, the key part of it, revolves around gas and therefore around electricity. And part of the challenge I think we're facing here is obviously this is a kind of a Euro-centric crisis when we talk about gas and electricity. But that, of course, affects the rest of the world, as you alluded to in your opening remarks. And Europe's ability to impose its needs on the rest of the world, and particularly on Asia and the developing world, is a key factor in spreading this crisis further. In the sense that Europe is sucking in all available LNG supplies, and therefore others having to go short, and that's not only driving up prices, but causing actual physical shortages or physical unavailability, or at least unaffordability in numerous developing countries. So this kind of export of the crisis is very important, and I think really I want to draw attention here to kind of two. This is not meant to be a beat up Europe session, but and I think there's been quite a bit of that in terms of past policy. But I draw attention to two parts of Europe's failings that I think are continuing to go forward in policy to deal with this crisis. One of those is as I refer to this export of the crisis and the lack of attention to the impact that it has on other countries. And European politicians are responsive to their voters. Voters are seeing high prices and so on. They're concerned. They're naturally concerned, and not surprising, that's their top priority, even when you consider solidarity or the lack of it within Europe, let alone with other countries. But this is a dangerous trend. Firstly, obviously on the energy security viewpoint and the viewpoint of the economies of these other countries and humanitarian side, but also there's factors here that ultimately affect the global economy and affect stability of other important countries. So this kind of short-sightedness, it's understandable, but it's problematic. And the second part of that, I think, the second part of the failing of European policymakers is on the market interventions. We're seeing all kind of proposals for price caps. We've seen subsidies. We're seeing both consumer subsidies and bailouts of companies, of utility companies who can't match up their gas purchases and can't afford the supply commitments they've made. These kind of policies. These are these are also problematic. And I think, again, these policies are understandable in the short term, but they're counterproductive. On the one hand, the policies are extremely expensive. They're not sustainable. You will see policies that are carried up till April next year. And okay, maybe they're affordable up until April, but we're not going to be out of this crisis by April. I think it's pretty clear. And you could argue perhaps in some ways that the winter of 23-4 will be not as bad as the winter of 22-3, or it could be worse, in terms of energy supply. It's certainly not going to be easy. And so these interventions that last up until April, they're going to have to be repeated, but then do they remain affordable? And we've seen, obviously, in the UK recently, the the financial markets punishing a government that wasn't able to be fiscally responsible. That wasn't just about energy, but energy was certainly part of it. So we have these kind of interventions which are very expensive, not affordable over a sustained period, are sustaining energy demand at the point that we need to be cutting energy demand, and also kind of badly thought out in disturbing market signals. Now, yes, vulnerable consumers have to be protected. Yes, Europe has to protect as much of its business and industry as it possibly can, but that also has to be done in a productive way rather than a counterproductive way. And recognizing that we have a simple shortage of supply here. If you take out the world's largest gas exporter and you make it a negligible factor in the world market, there's going to be a shortage. It's unavoidable. And no matter what kind of market interventions and changes of price mechanism and new benchmarks you introduce, you will not get around that fundamental problem. The only solutions that are increase energy supply and decrease demand. And you know that the increasing supply is going to take time, and the decreasing demand is going to be painful. And it's a question of how that pain is dealt with and allocated in the least destructive way.
Thanks, Robin. I want to bring in Anne-Sophie now. One of the first things Robin mentioned was the power component there, and certainly a lot of discussion of European policy as well. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit as well with some of your view, and particularly where maybe some of these policy questions see us moving between now and 2025?
Yeah, I mean, just to build up on what Robin said, I mean, this is really a matter of 140 billion liters of Russian pipeline gas, which is missing and cannot be replaced. I mean, no matter how much LNG you want to bring, it's not enough. It was not enough in terms of LNG import infrastructure in Europe, which is why it's being expanded right now. And it's not enough in terms of how much we can actually bring to Europe in 2022 in terms of additional LNG supply and in terms of diversion as well. So it's very important to understand that. Whatever we have actually managed to bring in 2022 is not enough. So my calculation is that we are going to be down from 140 to 60 billion cubic meters of Russian pipeline gas, so minus 80 billion cubic meters, and all the additional LNG, Norwegian gas, Azeri pipeline gas, lower actually North African pipeline gas supplies and lower production is about plus 50 billion cubic meters, plus additional needs in terms of storage. So this is actually balanced by lower gas demand. Lower gas demand by about 10% in 2022. But the problem we are facing for 2023 is that it's pretty sure that Russian pipeline gas supplies are going to be even lower. Because right now we are seeing flows at 25 billion cubic meters. And it's really not sure that we are going to keep these flows, in particular the flows through Ukraine, which is about half of that. So it is possible that for 2023, we are going to be down to 15 billion cubic meters. So we will have to have another 45 BCM coming from somewhere. And when you are looking at the LNG balance, you're really wondering, where is it going to come from? Can we take away more gas away from Asia? Very uncertain. There is absolutely not that much additional LNG supply which is coming online. And this is absolutely fundamental. We know that the period 2022-2025 is not going to bring a lot of additional LNG supply. And the biggest question mark is on Arctic LNG 2, which is in Russia, which can be impacted by sanctions, but we don't know how much. So just to go back on your questions about power. So we need to reduce demand in Europe. And one very surprising thing is that gas demand in the power generation has actually increased, not decreased. And why is that? This is because on one side, nuclear generation has been declining. So part of that is unfortunately things which are happening in France, delayed maintenance, problem with corrosion, a political decommissioning also in Germany, which is likely to continue in April next year, unless they change their mind. That would be great. But also climate change impact on hydro. Maybe people have not realized, but we are looking at a minus 25% in terms of hydro generation. So in order to replace this missing terawatt hours of hydro and nuclear, you need to bring in more wind, more solar, but this is not enough. So more gas and more coal. This is why we are bringing back coal, but even that has not been enough. So where does that lead us? Well, this is leading us to some very strange things happening on the power generation sector. And this is where, the policy action is interesting because gas-fired plants have been at the margin and therefore setting up the power price, which is therefore extremely high. And the European governments are facing both extremely high gas prices and extremely high power prices. So the way European governments are trying to deal with the very high power prices is to set a limit to the inframarginal producers, power producers. So we are talking about wind, solar, hydro, nuclear. And the proposal is to limit that to 180 euro per megawatt hour. So whatever is on top, so the difference between the spot price and this 180 euro per megawatt hour is going to go into a big pot. And that money, which is expected to be somewhere around 140 billion euros, but we don't really know because, you would need to have perfect prediction of the electricity produced and the cost of electricity, which is totally impossible. But that money would be in order to help users of electricity. One of the interesting things which some people are trying to propose is that we extend the Iberian measure to the wider Europe. So what is the Iberian measure? In Spain and Portugal, what they have done in order to lower the price of electricity is to limit the price of gas in power generation. But as I always say, whatever measure you take is going to have unintended consequences. So there are a few unintended consequences there. The first one is that because we have moved gas-fired plants down the merit order, guess what happened? Gas demand in the power generation has almost doubled in Spain. So instead of basically reducing your demand, which is exactly where we want to go, it has actually worsened the problem. So if we do that at a European level, this is not going to be good at all. The other thing is that because you do that in a region which is, still attached to the rest of Europe, well, exports of electricity towards France have, of course, increased because the price in France is much higher. So again, unintended consequences. One could think that, if we do that at a European EU level, there would be less border effects, but, there could still be, for example, with United Kingdom, maybe with Norway. So that could be still quite interesting. But for me, the most worrying thing is if you try to basically cap the price of gas in the power generation sector, it might actually increase gas demand in the power sector, which is exactly what we don't want to see. And let me add a final thing, well, two final things. The first one is that while our politicians are very happy to see gas demand being reduced in some countries, the sector which is seeing its gas demand being reduced the most is the industrial sector. This is, in terms of the economy, not good news because what we are seeing now is economic pain. It's reduced industrial output. It's fertilizer closing down or working at reduced output. And the final thing, which is very important for any would-be or existing LNG exporter, is the impact on Asia. We are getting in Europe more LNG because we are taking that away from Asia, in particular countries like China, but also Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are not able to compete against Europe. We are likely to see 3 years of high gas prices because there is only going to be that much of LNG coming to the market during that period. So there is a real important question about how this is going to impact the future of gas/LNG in Asia. And I think this is critical because Europe was never meant to be a big LNG market, a big gas market. This is a declining region by all means. Asia is a growing market. If we lower the demand forecast in Asia, well, this is going to be at the detriment of all the LNG producers. And that, I think, is absolutely fundamental. So if I were an LNG producer, I will look a little bit at Europe, but really look at Asia and how to make sure that demand is going to continue to grow. I know the period is going to be tough, but we need to think post-2025. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie. That's actually a really great outline, I think, especially in terms of where we are on a lot of demand. And your point there on Asia, I think, is a good place to kind of pivot to the supply side a little bit. I want to bring in Jamie to talk a bit about what we're seeing in the region in terms of supply developments. There's obviously a lot of liquefaction capacity coming online around the mid-decade point around the world. In terms of the Mideast Gulf, Qatar is obviously the major player there. But Jamie, I can just kick it over to you if you want to maybe build out on that a bit and talk about supply side a bit more.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction there. Yeah, as you say, the Middle East is kind of synonymous with oil and gas. So when there's a shortfall, where do politicians head? They head to the Middle East, whether it's out of any real belief that they can get anything or whether it's for domestic political considerations. It's the Middle East that they head to. And yeah, we've seen European political heavyweights they've beaten a path to MENA capitals ever since the invasion of Ukraine in February, as they seek security of supply as gas as well as oil. I think the most recent leader was probably German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who visited, the usual trio, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Qatar last month. And certainly one of the most concrete developments from that trip was a commitment for LNG deliveries to start later this year and continue into 2023 as well. But European states, they're dashing to the region in search of gas. But I think they're going to need to have quite a lot of stamina if they want to secure any substantial volumes here. As was touched upon earlier, there hasn't really been that much momentum on the supply side in the Middle East for quite a significant period of time up until recently. And as you speak to any producers in the region, they'll tell you that bringing on new gas production capacity, new gas export capacity, this is a multi-year project. So you can't just flick a switch and bang, there you go. So Qatar, they brought its big wave of LNG production on in around 2011, but then there was a malaise in the region. Now that's transformed, very, very dynamic sector. But as Qatar's Minister of State for Energy Affairs said just last week, there won't really be any new volumes until 2025, 2026. So that's clearly a problem when we're facing such a short and near-term crunch, as Anne-Sophie kind of pointed towards numbers of, Russia supplying Europe with 140, 150 BCM, and at least half of that off the table this year, possibly 90% of it next year. But as I said, when we look at the Middle East, the gas picture has transformed in recent years. Less than 10 years ago, we had the moratorium on Qatar's North Field. That was firmly in place. The UAE was actually looking to bring in a second FSRU for gas imports. Saudi oil burn was marching inexorably upwards because of gas shortages there. Oman was restricting LNG exports and preparing for gas shortfalls in the medium term, and Kuwait was starting LNG imports. That situation has now been completely transformed, with the exception of Kuwait. Kind of all the GCC states have injected dynamism and newfound vigor into their gas sector. Even in Bahrain, we've got them currently drilling deep gas appraisal wells there. Qatar is obviously the headliner. It's probably the third largest LNG exporter now. It got overtaken by Australia, probably been overtaken by the US now, although we'll see if that LNG plant that was off for maintenance is brought back on now. They've brought foreign partners into their LNG expansion project that will lift capacity from 77 million tons a year to 110 million tons and then 126 million tons a year by around 2026, 2027. Mr. Moratorium himself is, of course, the energy minister there, but he was the one who lifted that moratorium, and it's brought the industry's biggest names in. In the UAE as well, ADNOC, they have announced that they are going to bring online a new LNG export facility in Fujairah. That's probably going to be about 5 years away now, though. So ultimately, they can maybe squeeze a little bit more out of their existing facilities on Das Island. But primarily, if they're going to be supplying Europe with anything from there, that's going to be at the expense of traditional buyers in Asia. And it's a similar story in Oman, where, they are debottlenecking their 3-train facility there. They hit record exports of about 10 million tons a year last year, but there's not really any big gains there. They're looking at LNG bunkering, they're looking at blue ammonia, they're not looking at any 4th train for their LNG export facilities there. So ultimately, when it comes to the Middle East, there's not going to be any big gains for at least 5 years. And Saudi Arabia, they've kind of teased at the idea of possibly swinging into LNG exports previously, but that's very much off the table now. Maybe they'll invest in overseas facilities like Qatar has done in Golden Pass in the US. But domestically, they are looking to the phase beyond LNG, which they see as being blue ammonia, blue hydrogen, that kind of thing. Basically, the long and short of it is that Europe's going to need stamina if they want to be seeing any additional LNG from the region. Also, pipeline gas from Kurdistan, that's brought up every now and then, but we're seeing rocket attacks at the key gas field in Iraqi Kurdistan. Frankly, if the story of the oil sector in Kurdistan tells us anything, it's that it's a very volatile region that nobody should be reliant on for any security of supply for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Jamie. You mentioned Schultz's trip to the Gulf, and I think there were some supply agreements that came out there with the UAE. It is interesting, though, that we've in the last couple of years seen something like 120 million tons in new supply agreements signed, and a lot of those have durations that go out to a 20-year period. So there's definitely an argument to be made for some that would constitute a bullish long-term outlook. Robin, maybe I can come back to you again and just kind of focus in on that mid-decade point a bit more. Is it a surprise that there haven't been some of these longer-term agreements between the Gulf and Europe at this point? And what do you see that potentially doing to supply, particularly keeping Asia in mind? Maybe we can bring in Anne-Sophie for that as well.
Well, I think Jamie frames it very well, right? That it's about stamina. Does Europe have the stamina to develop these projects and these relationships over a long period of time? And Europe's had this opportunity for the past decade and more, as we know, to develop new supplies from North Africa, the Caspian, and the Middle East, whether mostly pipeline gas, also LNG, and has not taken those opportunities and now sees the price of it. So that is a very relevant part. And look, the challenge that Europe faces here is as Anne-Sophie alludes to, it's the contradiction between the long-term gas outlook for Europe and its decarbonisation agenda, and the short to medium-term outlook, which requires a huge amount more gas to replace Russia. But you can't build an LNG plant or a major international pipeline off the back of a 5-year or even a 10-year commitment. And the major producers like Qatar, they're looking for 20-year contracts. Now, Qatar could build these plants based on shorter-term commitments. It'll always be the lowest cost global producer of LNG. But it wants to have that certainty, and it wants primarily long-term contracts for its supply. Asian countries have traditionally been willing to sign up to that, and European companies right now can't, because they just don't have the certainty of demand beyond 2030. There'll be sufficient gas demand that won't have been replaced by renewables, hydrogen, or whatever else. It's a real contradiction. And this is where kind of the stamina, but also the imagination in European policy making has to come in. I see a few angles for the Europeans on this. I think there's some room for strategic partnerships with Asian countries to say, look, we need the LNG now over the next 5 to 10 years. You need it in the future. Can we have some kind of an agreement back to back to get these major LNG projects going forward? Can we have commitments on CCS, carbon capture and storage, for example, so we can take gas with a commitment that it'll be burned in a zero carbon way. These are the things we're going to need to get that kind of long-term certainty. Now, that said, I would say this applies to pipeline projects into Europe very much. It applies to LNG projects outside the Middle East. Take a place like Mozambique, right? You have projects in developing countries, political risks and so on. You have international oil company sponsors for those. They need the long-term certainty of demand. Middle East countries are in a somewhat better position. I mean, they can to a large extent finance these things themselves. This is a bit more, the desire for long-term contracts for them is a bit more of a strategic choice, rather than absolute necessity. But as I come back to it, if Asian countries are willing to sign long-term contracts, as they have done historically, that's where the volumes will go, not to Europe, or Europe will pay top dollar to lure them away from China, as it's doing at the moment.
Thanks. And Anne-Sophie, anything you'd like to add there?
I fully agree with Robin on the fact that there is a huge uncertainty for European players in terms of how much LNG they are going to, or natural gas imports they are going to need in the long term. I mean, when you are looking at the Repower EU strategy, it's relatively scary for natural gas demand, which is expected to really be reduced by 2030. Of course, nobody really believes in the Repower EU strategy because this is extremely ambitious. I would call it aspirational. But the problem is, where are you between some sort of business as usual and the Repower EU strategy? And this is exactly the kind of problem that everybody is facing. So, and on top of that, it's not only the demand side picture that you have to understand well, it's also the supply side, because Europe right now is trying to court everybody. So it wants to basically develop its biomethane production. There are some people within Europe who are talking about developing domestic production, which includes the East Med, but also countries like Romania, for example. And on top of that, they are also courting Algeria in order to get additional pipeline gas. So it's a particularly complex equation depending on where you are. And this is why a lot of European players, in particular German players who are more inexperienced in terms of the LNG deals, are really struggling not only with this equation, but also in terms of getting a good deal. When they are going to see all the potential suppliers, they are saying we want a 10-year deal, and the suppliers are responding, well, I want a 20-year deal. And I was really smiling in March when I saw the agreement, or the statement between the European Union and the White House, because they were quoting targets by 2030. And then what? I mean, surely no US LNG liquefaction plant is going to take FID based on the commitment up to 2030. However, where I think this is going to be difficult or interesting is indeed, can you, or is it even going to work to have an agreement where European players are taking the LNG first and then Asian are taking the LNG later? This is an interesting but really complicated question. First of all, you are telling Asian countries, well, you have to wait until Europeans are figuring out their mess, which, as I just mentioned, they have absolutely no idea about future demand. Then you need to structure that deal between two different, completely different counterparties. So I am not sure. If I am Asian, I need to start, my decarbonization right now. We were looking at countries like the Philippines, like Vietnam, which had been building a lot of coal. We need to start seeing them switching from coal to natural gas this decade, not wait until Europe has basically sorted out all its problems. So, if such a thing would have to work, you would have to see, the Asian players already having something right this decade and not wait until something, Europe has finalized and is no longer needing all this LNG. And on top of that, they may not exactly have the same requirements in terms of LNG. We have talked about volumes, but we need also to talk about the prices and the green LNG requirements, because Europe has also some ambitions in terms of how clean this LNG has to be. But putting a lot of attention on the footprint, the carbon footprint of the LNG, which may be a secondary issues for some Asian countries which are really focusing on the price.
Thanks. That brings up a lot of good points, and there's a lot of that I'd like to get into. But one thing that did stick out to me is, talk of these kind of flexible volumes as well. We're talking about the Gulf today, and there's a major producer that is really known there for not being crazy about flexible LNG cargoes. Does the situation we're looking at now open the door maybe for more compromise there? There's been a lot of discussion, and this isn't the first place that it's been brought up by far, of kind of rising tension in some ways between major energy producers and consumers. How do anybody really that wants to take it, maybe see that affecting this kind of issue of destination clauses on cargoes coming out of the Gulf in the future?
Whenever I was talking to European Commission officials, they are always in favor of a transparent, liquid and flexible LNG market. They have been doing a lot of studies on that, and I've been part of the reflection groups on that. So this is their focus. And for me, the way I see that happening and unfolding is that the European players will be happy to see what we call the aggregators, so the BP, Shell, Total Energies, etc., contracting the LNG as they are doing right now, and then basically buying this LNG from them in the future. This is, I think, what is likely to happen because these companies are not indeed, do not want to do that. Now, I can also understand that, there might be some tension and frustrations, especially when I'm talking to some producers about, how European countries are behaving, like, the fact that they want cheap gas for only a short period. And you really have to contrast that kind of attitude against that of China, which over the past year and a half has signed no less than 29 long-term contracts. Actually 27 long-term contracts, 2 short-term contracts, and half of them were more than 20 years. And this is for about 50 billion cubic meters in total. So this is significant volumes that we are talking about. Why? Because, suddenly Chinese players realize that spot LNG on which they were relying upon is extremely expensive because this is spot. So they prefer to have something more stable. They do see, unlike the European players, a future for natural gas in their country. And they can basically afford to sign long-term contracts because they are going to expire somewhere in the 2040s or so. And also, when you are looking at their existing LNG contracts, quite a few of them are going to expire this decade. So, they are not over-contracting. The contracted LNG quantities are still going to decline over the period 2030. So they are fine. But really to put, to compare this kind of completely different behaviors between China and European players is very interesting and important.
Great. Well, that's probably a good point to start turning to some of the questions that we've got coming in, and we've talked a lot about different parts of the region. We haven't focused too much on the East Med just yet, so I certainly don't want to overlook that. But an interesting question here that came in from Mehroun Etabari on it seems like supply to Egyptian liquefaction capacity in the Eastern Mediterranean. And he asks, in the panel's opinion, is Egypt's worsened domestic gas balance outlook and its history of diverting gas to meet local demand a serious risk to LNG-focused development from Cyprus's Aphrodite or the next phase of Israel's Leviathan? How optimistic is the panel about these or other sources boosting Egypt's LNG by mid-decade? It is interesting because that domestic gas issue has come up, and I alluded to that at the beginning of the panel. That does seem to have shifted a bit in Egypt, though. Jamie, maybe I can send this one your way. You guys do a lot of work covering the East Med, so if you want to maybe take a shot at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to comment on that. So, yeah, Egypt certainly has had a renaissance when it comes to LNG, thanks to offshore discoveries like Zohr. But we're starting to see that even these discoveries suffer from the same natural decline rates that have afflicted most of Egypt's offshore developments. So that does certainly place the long-term future of viable Egyptian LNG exports into question. We're starting to see the effects of that already this year, but it's been interesting that effectively Egypt has been turning increasingly to fuel oil deliveries into power plants. So basically, sky-high gas prices mean that they can get more on the open market selling spot LNG than they are paying for even imported fuel oil to send to the power plant. So that's a interesting little arbitrage that Egypt is playing there. So is that a long-term strategy? That's questionable, and clearly, certainly in our expectation, is that in order for Egypt to be able to maintain LNG exports at current rates, let alone push them up further, that's where things like Leviathan deliveries are going to be going into. So rather than seeing this big wave of East Med's LNG cargoes hitting the market, it's basically just you have to keep going forward in order to stand still. Aphrodite, that's certainly an interesting one. There's been a lot in the media recently, understandably, on the border disputes between Israel and Lebanon, but bizarrely, Cyprus and Israel have not been able to finalize a unitization agreement for development of Aphrodite, and that's one of the big things that's actually holding up development plans there. So despite there being no real geopolitical differences between Nicosia and Israel, that's what's one of the big things that's stymieing development. So press pause on Cyprus development for now.
Certainly, thanks. And I have to just add to that and say I think I was definitely surprised to see an agreement move forward between Israel and Lebanon before something between Israel and Cyprus. That's maybe a sign that we're really living in some different times. We do have a question in house here from Ambassador Silliman, so I'll just turn to you.
Colby, thanks very much. There's been a lot of discussion about how European demand for gas can be replaced with other fuels or other sources. I want to ask you a question about Russian supply, because it seems to me that the Russian supply of gas is really focused on a short-term goal of getting Europeans to be so tired of paying higher energy prices that they will reduce their support for Ukraine. Maybe there are two questions. What do you see as the future of Russian gas? Is this going to result in real demand destruction for Russian gas? And if Europeans decide not to go with Russian gas in the future, where is Russia going to sell its gas? Are they going to go big time into LNG? The flip side of that, if the Russians can reduce the political support in Europe for Ukraine in the short term, will European governments head back to the use of Russian gas through existing pipelines in the next, 4 or 5 years?
Let me address those questions. So the first thing is that when you are looking at what Mr. Putin has been doing over the past 6 months or so, he has been really putting a lot of pressure on the different European governments. This is what I call in a report the divide and rule game. He started with, telling them, now you have to pay in ruble, which actually is not in the contracts, but, basically countries were left with no choice. And then suddenly they realized that Mr. Putin was extremely serious when he cut at the end of April the supplies to Poland and Bulgaria. And as you can imagine, at the beginning of May, all European companies and countries were in full panic mode because they realized that there was a very serious possibility that they would be cut by the end of May when they were supposed or expected to pay for their deliveries. And the result is that most of the countries and companies in Europe, with very few exceptions, comply to the terms. So basically, it was a first test of Mr. Putin, testing basically the resolve of European countries and companies. The second test came when something very unexpected happened, which is the lower delivery through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is this direct pipeline which is linking Russia to Germany. It has been as regular as a Swiss clock. Very constant supplies, maintenance during July, coming back, very, very constant supplies. And then suddenly, at the beginning of June, we're starting seeing the deliveries of Russian pipeline gas through Nord Stream 1 being declining step by step. And the explanation from Gazprom was very technical. This is your fault, Europeans, because the turbine is right now in Canada. It's being sanctioned, one turbine, which is absolutely essential for the functioning of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So we cannot operate at capacity without this turbine because we are a prudent operator. Please note whatever Russia has been doing so far has always been under basically the legal framework of the contracts. We are doing something with the contracts, but with the ruble payment, we are doing something, but this is, in our opinion, within the contractual terms. So you are not respecting the contractual terms, we cut you. We are a prudent operator. We cannot operate Nord Stream 1 at capacity. But and by the way, this is your fault because you have sanctioned the turbine, so therefore we have to take these measures. And this, again, is testing the resolve of European players because they see that suddenly Russian gas supplies are being reduced. And right now, they are at less than 20% of what they were on average in 2021. So, there are a lot of countries which are starting to think, what are we doing? Hungary has definitely taken a choice, which is we continue to buy natural gas from Russia. Bulgaria, which had been cut, has also been thinking about going back and negotiate with Russia. I don't think anything has happened. But, faced with extremely high gas prices and compare with the cheap gas that they were getting from Russia before, there have been voices also in Germany saying, why are we not actually using Nord Stream 2 pipeline? Because this is exactly the same pipeline. Now, in terms of can we basically get Russian gas as we did before? Well, now with the destruction of Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So just to explain where we are on this, so the pipelines have been sabotaged. So Nord Stream 1 is 2 different pipelines of each 27.5 BCM. Nord Stream 2 was the same, only Nord Stream 1 was operational. Nord Stream 2 was ready to be operational. Right now, the only thing which is supposed to be intact is one string of Nord Stream 2. So out of the 110 BCM per year of capacity, only 27.5 remains, but this has not been certified and authorized by the German regulator, so it cannot function. So at the best, you can get 27.5, but also there is one pipeline which remains and is not being used by Russia because of some sort of legal issues that they have invented themselves, which is the pipeline which was going before for Belarus and Poland. This is about 35 billion cubic meters, which, I mean, from a technical point of view, can operate now. Now, the additional thing on can we get more Russian gas is Ukraine. For me, it has been a miracle that nothing has happened in the infrastructure in Ukraine, given the intensity of the war and the missiles and rockets flowing everywhere. I am very surprised that nothing has happened. Given also the recent escalation of the conflict, I am not quite sure that this is going to remain that way because we see that energy infrastructure is really being targeted. Finally, I mean, that was on the infrastructure side, so I don't think we can go back to where we were before. But also, there is no way that Europe would ever want to be as dependent as Russia as it was. So maybe, staying constant on where we were in 2022, but we are not going back to where we were before. Absolutely no way.
Certainly. Thanks, Anne-Sophie. Another question that came in from Yusara Maliki. Question on Gulf/MENA intergas trade. We have seen Kuwait building massive LNG import capacity while Morocco is working on alternative gas routes due to row with Algeria. How do we see gas integration in the region itself, given growing demand? Where do Iran, large producer, and Turkey, large importer/hub, fit in? Robin, I'm going to send that your way first, and then if either Anne-Sophie or Jamie want to jump in as well, they can feel free.
Sure, thanks. Well, look, it's a very interesting question from Yasar, and I think in a funny way, it kind of almost answers itself, because Yasar rightly points to the lack of intra-Gulf and intra-MENA gas trade by pointing out Kuwait, which is a couple of hundred miles up the Gulf from the world's leading LNG exporter, is a major importer of LNG. Doesn't have a pipeline to Qatar. It's not that far from Iran either. Doesn't have a pipeline to Iran. Morocco's next to Algeria, a very large, important gas exporter. There is a pipeline running throughout Morocco, which delivers some gas to Morocco and goes on to Spain. That pipeline has been closed down in the political dispute between Morocco and Algeria, and incidentally helping to reduce supplies to Spain at a pretty critical time. So these political disputes have always been the curse of intra-MENA gas pipelines. And there's several other examples of pipelines that either never happened when they looked good, or they did happen and then had political problems and never functioned as intended. There's probably one good example, the Dolphin pipeline from Qatar to UAE and Oman, that has worked well without interruptions. That's like the one kind of shining example. Do we see more prospect for an improvement in this situation? Well, yeah, I think we will see more integration in these areas, as Jamie mentioned. There are links from Israel to Jordan and to Egypt now, and some gas moving around there. That probably would expand. Cyprus could be brought into that as well in possibly some joint offshore developments. There has been these attempts to get gas flowing through Syria to Lebanon, which look kind of dead for now over sanctions issues on the Assad regime. But Lebanon's in a tough spot, and that but it doesn't look like it's going to be getting gas soon to help. And then Yasar mentions a couple of the other big gas players in the region. Iran is a kind of modest exporter to Iraq and to Turkey, but nearly all of its gas is used domestically. Iran has very large reserves, has always struggled to develop them to their full potential, although production has risen a lot. But it has cheap subsidized gas at home. It has a lot of industry, and so consumes nearly all of its gas at home. Theoretically that could change. I think under a different government or even a different system that was more able to engage internationally, Iran could increase production and perhaps get a control on domestic consumption. Doesn't look like that's likely to happen anytime soon. And then you have Turkey, which is a big player as an importer and a user of gas. The largest, after Germany, the largest user of gas in Europe, if you consider it part of wider Europe. But minimal domestic production, and so it's really an importer and a transit state of gas from Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia, and LNG. Some of that goes on to Europe. But Turkey has made some big discoveries in the Black Sea, which is developing. So Turkey's supply situation in the next couple of years ought to improve significantly. And you've probably seen the recent discussions that Putin had proposed to Erdogan that Turkey should become a gas hub and presumably import Russian and other gas, and then be able to make some margin off re-exporting that to Europe. Which is obviously a political suggestion, on one which I don't think will be too popular with the Europeans. They don't want to exchange dependency on Russia for a dependency on another tricky neighbour. The one angle there, I think, which is interesting is, and Jamie mentioned this briefly, but the possibility of gas exports from Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, to Turkey and onto Europe. That has been on and off for years. Major political problems in its way, both domestically within Iran and regionally. But just on a technical and commercial basis, an excellent project. And I think although it's a long shot, I do think it's one that the US and the EU should put some weight behind. If you look around the pipeline options that Europe has, we've just said Algeria is tricky for various reasons. Azerbaijan perhaps can do a bit more. The East Med has kind of its own domestic demand in Egypt to cope with, and then again political and border disputes. And then Kurdistan, there is a realistically 10 to 20 BCM that could come from Kurdistan under a suitable political arrangement. So all these things are very tough, but that's the hard work of economic diplomacy in a crisis like this to try to make some of these things happen.
Great. Anything, Jamie, Anne-Sophie, you'd like to add there?
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to jump in. Robin covered most of the ground there. I think dolphin pipeline's one of the really fascinating examples in the region because, during the Qatar embargo, the UAE was taking a very hard line stance on most things Qatar, but interestingly, flows continued uninterrupted on that. So it was an interesting little example of how, the critical nature of gas to the UAE economy kind of overrode political concerns there. Of course, Dolphin also supplies Oman. Another interesting thing that gets brought up from time to time that I certainly don't think will ever materialize is a gas pipeline from Iran to Oman. Frankly, it doesn't make sense anymore. Iran is struggling with its own natural declines, and officials are talking about having gas shortages in winter, whereas Oman has so much gas they don't even know what to do with all of it anymore. PDO is acting as a swing producer, toning down gas production to enable other private companies to maximize output. They're in talks with the likes of Total and Shell just on, hang on, what can we do to use all this abundant gas that we've suddenly got our hands on? Is it LNG bunkering? Is it blue ammonia? Is it another LNG export train? Tell us what to do. And then, of course, you've got the political issues there of massive sanctions on Iran. So it's interesting there that Oman, it won't say no, but just because it likes to play that regional balancing act of keeping on side with the other GCC states, also keeping on side with a large, unpredictable neighbor in Iran. So that is a bit of a zombie project that keeps hanging on over everyone's heads. Kuwait, as well, as Robin mentioned, another way to look at that is it's fascinating how Iraqi officials have recently started talking about the possibility of building an LNG import terminal themselves and getting LNG in from Qatar. And I'm just sat there thinking, hang on, Kuwait has a massive LNG import terminal itself now that they've just brought online. It is too big to supply all of Kuwait's needs, and you have a border with them. It makes, clearly, just on a feasible nature, this is the logical route to go. Just build a little gas pipeline up from Al Zor into Iraq. Everybody's happy, but politics means that that's something that won't go down very well in Baghdad. So that's a logical project that I would like to see happen, but I don't hold out much hope.
Certainly. So I want to keep going with this theme of talking about gas trade and consumption in the region. Over the past few years, unconventionals have started to play a bigger role. That's going to certainly be the case with Jafurah in Saudi Arabia, although we're not really talking about them as an exporter. Certainly the case in the UAE and Oman as well. I wanted to see if maybe we could just delve into it a bit in terms of what, with a higher production cost, unconventionals might mean for some of the growth that we've seen in the region in the past that's been fueled by cheap gas, as well as maybe what the higher production costs might mean for some of these ambitions we're seeing around blue hydrogen and ammonia, as well as subsidies as well. And anybody have any thoughts on that they'd like to get out front in particular?
I'm happy to kick this off if you like. Robin? Oh, okay.
No,
yes.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, so Oman's definitely been the trailblazer when it comes to unconventional gas in the Middle East. BP developing the Kazan tight gas development there, which was subsequently expanded to a second phase, Gazir, so that's about 1.5 billion cubic feet a day now, I believe. And now Saudi Arabia with the Jafurah one, which you mentioned. It is low-cost gas, relatively speaking, but still the scale of the project and the time frame over which they plan to produce from it, the numbers are staggering. I mean, it's more than $100 billion over the lifetime of that, which is a phenomenal number. But still, they say that it's that the economics are there, that it's still cheaper than comparable gas developments elsewhere. Eagle Ford is always the one that these guys start comparing it to, and they're bringing a lot of expertise from the likes of Halliburton, Baker Hughes, those kind of people over there to help develop that there. Ruwais Diab in Abu Dhabi, that's the big development there that Total Energies are working on. Again, conversation I've had with ADNOC, with Total, they've said that on a cost basis, this is still extremely competitive. And they also, clearly there's a lot more energy that goes into unconventional gas development than conventional, but they say that the carbon footprint is still competitive. Still very low emissions coming out of these developments. So it doesn't get in the way of their plans of marketing the cleanest supplies that around the globe, basically.
Thanks, Jamie. It seemed like almost everybody wanted to jump in, although maybe not at the beginning. But Anne-Sophie, if you had anything to add, then why don't you go ahead, and then Robin, maybe we can wrap it up with you.
I just wanted to highlight a thing about, the blue ammonia or blue hydrogen. So, first of all, in order to be competitive as a hydrogen producer, you would need to have cheap gas, that's for sure. Something like $4 per MMBTU and below. But the important point about, the production is that this is not the most important thing about the hydrogen value chain, because if you want to be an exporter of hydrogen, and whether you are, an exporter of hydrogen based on renewable in Chile or in Morocco or based on natural gas in Saudi Arabia, the transport cost and how you are going to transport this hydrogen or hydrogen derivative is absolutely important, because it's going to be as high as the cost of production itself. And for me, there is absolutely a question mark on what are we exporting actually. Are we exporting hydrogen or hydrogen-related fuel, whether this is liquid hydrogen, whether this is ammonia, which then presents, additional difficulties, or liquid organic hydrogen carriers? There are also many people who are talking about e-methane now. Or are we exporting finished products or semi-finished products, which means that suddenly there is a boost for the industrial sector in developing countries which have a high potential in terms of hydrogen development, low-cost hydrogen development, at the detriment of those countries which want to import hydrogen, in particular European countries, as well as Japan and Korea. So there is an absolutely fundamental question mark here about industrial development. And I think this is really important to understand, because also when you are talking about hydrogen, this is going to be a cost plus business. You are never going to get the same rent as you were getting before, because basically you are talking about something which is by nature relatively expensive. Even the $1 per kilogram target that everybody is talking about is about $9 per MMBTU. So by all means, this is not cheap. Of course, it becomes cheaper when you are taking high carbon prices into account, but still. So this is going to be likely a cost plus business. So the margins is what you get, not the rent business. There is no equivalent of the $5 per barrel Saudi oil in the hydrogen business.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And Robin, if you want to finish it up, then I think we can probably move along.
Yeah, look, I think Anne-Sophie mentions two critical points there. If not three. The one that if you're talking about unconventional gas, more difficult, challenging developments, more difficult reservoirs, the costs in general are going to be higher, and being cost competitive is crucial. If this is gas for domestic use, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, if it's intended primarily to replace oil, that's okay. If it's intended to support LNG exports, then or indeed hydrogen exports, that gas has to be competitive with plenty of other sources around the world, which are potentially lower cost. I mentioned Mozambique earlier. You've got several giant conventional gas fields around Africa which can be developed for LNG, and at pretty low production costs. And is the unconventional gas from the Gulf going to be competitive with that for export? Is it going to be competitive with Qatar and its huge conventional reserves? No, I mean nobody will ever beat Qatar. But can you be competitive with the next kind of tranche of competition? And then there's of course US LNG as well. US LNG is based mostly on unconventional gas, but very competitively produced unconventional gas. So that's one critical point. I think the point Anne-Sophie makes about exporting critical materials, so decarbonized materials, for example. If you can use your gas or hydrogen to make steel, aluminium, chemicals, cement, materials like this that you can produce at a low carbon footprint and export those instead, that is a much easier game than trying to export hydrogen, which is a tricky thing to export and with high transport costs. So I think the development of the Gulf as a center of energy intensive industry, it already is to an extent, very much in aluminium, but extending that to other materials is a pretty natural development, and an important one. But then, the third point there, the generation of rent. So this really demands that the Gulf moves from a kind of a rent-based model to an internationally competitive and more sophisticated economic model, which has been the process of, ever since the 70s, but it's only, it's a long-term process and a step-by-step one. So that is about going up the value chain and producing bulk materials, but then starting to produce specialized chemicals, then plastics, then automotive components, and, going step by step, as the East Asian exporters have done. But the Gulf, that's a pretty tricky challenge for the Gulf. It's starting already from a much higher income level. It's not going to be a low cost, low wage manufacturing area. It has to jump in at quite a sophisticated level. How do you skip those technological steps? So this kind of industry, whether based on gas or hydrogen from renewables, is important but tricky. And then I think just one more point there on the rents. I think it's a very important, interesting one, given that we're talking here about gas. The enormous rents that have made states rich are mostly oil rents, not gas rents. Right? Oil. You produce oil in Saudi at $5 a barrel and sell it at 100. Obviously, you have enormous profitability. Gas, because the price of gas on the world market has generally been lower, and because transport costs are to get to end user markets are higher, it's never generated those same rents. Same issue for Russia. Russia's an exceptionally low cost gas producer and with huge reserves, but once you build the thousands of kilometers of pipeline from Siberia to get to Europe and sell into a competitive market, gas is only a relatively modest part of the Russian budget. Most of the state budget depends on oil, and the same for the Middle East. Qatar is kind of the exception, but Qatar, because its gas reserves are so competitive and because it's a small country, its gas rents are pretty material. They're not that material to most other budgets. So to generate economic value from gas, you have to do something else with it. And that's indeed what we're seeing in the rest of the Middle East. Yeah, there are some new export projects, but the focus is primarily on domestic gas and using that for more value-added uses.
Thanks, Robin. And that actually, all those comments raise a lot of good points because, it gets away from gas a bit, but I think a lot of the hydrogen discussion right now as it pertains to the Gulf specifically is usually centered on exports, and we don't really get into domestic use that much. So certainly a lot to get into there. But moving away from that, and just kind of keeping with the theme of the competitiveness of Gulf exports, with this greater focus on Europe, I think it's good to just devote a little bit of time to kind of some of the more upstream decarbonization efforts that we've seen start to emerge in the Gulf. Obviously, Qatar Energy, formerly Qatar Petroleum, is really likes to showcase its efforts in that space, but we're certainly seeing more of that from the UAE now as well. With this kind of shorter term focus on security, I think it would be good to just touch on those efforts and where we kind of see that spending going, because it seems to be very much remaining a long-term feature of the discussion. And Anne-Sophie, a lot of your comments, I think, have hit that home pretty well. But in terms of trying to clean up the upstream and reduce carbon intensity to make exports more competitive, what do we think the next phase of that is? And Jamie, maybe I can come to you first if you're okay with that, and then Anne-Sophie, I'd love to get your thoughts too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most essential phase and that has to come next is for the industry to develop metrics and standards in order to actually measure the carbon intensity, whether it's oil, whether it's gas. ADNOC has kind of let the cat out of the bag a little bit by being a bit too honest when it comes to the methodology of some of their test blue ammonia exports, where they fessed up and said that the carbon that they captured, a lot of it was reinjected into onshore oil fields to boost production there. So that's the kind of complexity of this whole sector right there, because how do you measure that? On the one hand, yes, the carbon intensity of this gas product that we are selling you has been lowered, but on the other hand, we've increased our oil production as a result of it, and that is leading to increased emissions elsewhere in the value chain. So really, we need a rigorous industry standard just so that end users can say, okay, this is a complex matter, but I can see here X. Qatar is on this level, Abu Dhabi is on this level, and Morocco's on this level over here. This is, Algeria. Just so that you can put a value on it, and just so that you can put a carbon footprint value on it as well as an economic one. Then in terms of the phases beyond that, clearly solar is playing an increasingly large role in this. Qatar, they've announced 2 new solar plants that they plan to put in place at Ras Laffan and Mesaid that are going to specifically go into reducing the carbon intensity of their industrial production there, whether that be LNG, petrochemicals, refined goods, or maybe some other element of the manufacturing chain, pushing out gas in Qatar's instance from the process so that they lower the carbon footprint there. In other countries like Saudi Arabia, this can be done to push out oil, which obviously increases the net benefit from bringing in solar. But the more complex thing is carbon capture, which has been alluded to in the conversation earlier. Frankly, it's still very much an untested sector, I think. A lot of countries, a lot of IOCs are pinning their future strategies basically on carbon capture technology being able to massively reduce the carbon footprint of their products and therefore extend the lifetime in markets in the West and in Asia as well. But no, I don't think anybody really has a clue on whether this is going to be viable, whether it's going to be able to be rolled out on scale and in a way that you are still cost competitive with other rivals and in ways that doesn't bankrupt the consuming nations, basically.
Thanks, Jamie. Anne-Sophie, your thoughts?
Yes, so I think the carbon intensity of any fuel is now going to be one of the most important parts of this fuel. So whether we are looking at LNG or looking at hydrogen, now everybody is talking about carbon intensity. Just look at the latest Inflation Reduction Act from the United States where they are giving a production tax credit to hydrogen. This is based on the greenhouse gas emission, and they have a specific tool in order to calculate that for different types of hydrogen. So now this is what everybody needs to focus upon. And it goes along with reducing the carbon footprint and in particular measuring and reducing methane emissions. I mean, it's pretty clear when you are looking at the work from the IEA that we absolutely need to reduce methane emission starting this decade. And I think, the methane pledge, which was agreed upon in the last COP, was absolutely fundamental. We need to get there. We need to reduce methane emissions. I agree this is not only a problem for the natural gas or the oil and natural gas industry. I mean, it should also affect coal, and this is also coming from other sources, but we may have some low-hanging fruits. And frankly, when you are looking at the gas prices right now, I mean, it makes absolute sense to try to capture every single molecule and market it rather than venting it or even burning it. I mean, it has such a value that we absolutely want to capture that right now. So I think this is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Another question in-house from Robert Mogilnicki.
Thank you. Earlier in the conversation, somebody mentioned China and longer-term gas contracts. I'd be very curious to hear from everyone what your view is for Chinese demand of Middle Eastern gas and where it's headed. Thank you.
So I think I did, and I mentioned that so there were about 29 contracts signed by Chinese players, and I mean they also signed, among other things, some deals with Qatar actually very early. So they signed some deals with LNG exporters starting in 2022, 2023, and some other deals starting later. So China wants to contract LNG on a long-term basis because they suddenly find that it's much cheaper to have an oil indexation or Henry Hub indexation compared to the current spot prices. So this is one of the main reasons. There is appetite, as I mentioned before, because the amount of contracted LNG by China is going to diminish post-2030. However, I mean, there is, a lot of uncertainty on what Chinese future gas demand could be. I mean, right now, it makes sense to basically build up natural gas demand, and in particular, when you are looking at, displacing coal by natural gas. But we can see that at the same time, China doesn't want to be too dependent on foreign gas supplies, whether they are pipeline or whether they are LNG. I mean, they have had some tensions with the United States in the past during the period 2018-19. They had also some tensions with Australia, which is their largest LNG supplier. So, they also want to diversify. I wouldn't be surprised because this has been mentioned several times. They would be very interested in having also some sort of strategic investment in the Qatari gas field in the expansion. They have been going around, and I think having not only a deal in terms of buying this LNG, but also some sort of stake ownership in the development. That would be, I think, aligned with some of the big NOCs there.
Thanks, Anne-Sophie. You mentioned investment in Qatar, and one thing that came up earlier that I think is probably worth revisiting is Gulf investment in liquefaction capacity overseas. The obvious standout example, because it's, I think, really for the moment the only one, is Golden Pass here in the U.S. on the Gulf Coast, with Qatar Energy and ExxonMobil being the partners there. I think Qatar Energy is kind of the obvious NOC to look at in terms of that, surely because of the amount of upstream acreage they have outside of Qatar. But there's been discussion of this taking place before for a couple of years, and the most prominent example there would be the potential Saudi Aramco stake, and I think a Sempra project also on the Gulf Coast. But someone mentioned that earlier, and Jamie, I think it was you. Do we see that moving in this direction? Instead of necessarily looking at new capacity, do we see Gulf investors moving elsewhere, either in liquefaction or other assets. I think Saad El-Kaabi for a while alluded to the possibility that there might be investments further up the value chain in the United States. Maybe we're not thinking about that so much now, but in terms of investment and production outside of the Gulf or outside of the region, is there space for that? Is there any momentum there? Jamie, I'll send that to you first, and then anyone can join.
Sure, there's certainly space for that. Momentum is another question. As you mentioned, Saudi Arabia and Sempra was the big one. That has gone nowhere. Saudis have pulled out of that deal now. So they are still suggesting that they are willing to invest in overseas LNG. It certainly makes sense. And there's no logical reason why they shouldn't. But, they've previously talked about investing in the Russian projects in the Arctic as well. But again, that got held up, and that's not okay, Saudi Arabia is maintaining relations with Russia, but it's a big step to go ahead and invest in big LNG production facilities there. So I'd be surprised if that happens anytime soon. But I think that it's one thing that would be interesting to look at is that it's not necessarily just investing in an LNG facility per se. We've now got these Gulf sovereign wealth funds that are flush with cash again. And they've previously shown a penchant for investing in IOCs, Qatar Investment Agency and Shell, for instance, Qatar QIA also in Rosneft. It's not really an LNG. So that could be an interesting dynamic to watch to see if these sovereign wealth funds decide that they want to start snapping up new or bigger stakes in IOCs that are big portfolio players when it comes to LNG.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot here, so I think if there are any other points that anyone on the panel definitely wants to add, we can certainly get into that. But towards the end, I think that 2025 waypoint kind of featured prominently when we started the discussion here. I do want to come back and address the amount of new supply that's going to be coming online around mid-decade. Where we see that hitting prices, and I think also just from a more regional perspective, what kind of an impact that might have as well for exporters specifically, and how that might alter strategy in the long term. Robin, maybe we can start with you, and then I think Anne-Sophie, if you'd like to pick that up with any thoughts, that would be good.
Yeah, I think the key dates for me is really 26, 27, because that is when substantial new LNG capacity hits the market from Qatar, obviously, but also from Abu Dhabi, from US, various other projects. And that is when the supply-demand balance really ought to turn around. It's also when the first major hydrogen projects from the Gulf and some other places would start exporting ammonia primarily, but also helping to displace gas and proving up that business model. So those are the really critical dates. Now, I think what will happen then, so we'll have gone from 2022 or even 21 through to 25 with a very tight gas market, very little new supply, obviously a huge supply probably being taken out of the market. And the markets that we were looking for growth in this period, in the pre-war period, in Asia, we thought, well, these markets are going to develop, industrialize, they're going to replace coal with gas, they're going to use gas to clean up urban air pollution and so on. That's not going to happen because the gas won't be available, it'll be too expensive, and Europe will take it. So we're going to have a 5-year period with very low overall natural gas demand growth or even shrinkage, but a huge reallocation of flows. 26, 27, that all changes around again as the new LNG comes on, and it's going to come on into a pretty remarkably transformed market. Hard to say exactly how that plays out, but I think that you can expect the LNG market is a very cyclical market historically, and swings wildly from oversupply to undersupply and back again. And you have to think that much new supply hitting a market that's seen minimal demand growth for years is going to overwhelm it and cause a significant drop in prices. Do we then go into the delayed Asian gas transition and finally in the late 2020s go back to seeing considerable coal to gas switching? Or has Asia moved on by then and gone much more down the renewables route and gas then is much less a factor? I think probably rather more of the latter. And I think if you look at India, India very close to the Gulf, looks like a major LNG destination. India has basically said, well, gas for us, it's for fertilizers. because that's kind of indispensable. But actually, we can do fertilizers with hydrogen now. Some city gas for kind of a little bit for cooking use, a little bit for vehicles. Well, vehicles can use electricity. Battery vehicles are really soaring in India. And gas for power, no, minimal gas for power. Power the coal will continue the mainstay, decreasing over time, and the rest will be filled by renewables. So I think we're going to see a very different Asian gas market from what we might have seen if this crisis hadn't come along. And the same in Europe. We talk about Europe turning back to coal. Yeah, that's a temporary factor at the moment. Again, this crisis is giving a huge boost to renewables in Europe, which are already again really accelerated, and over the next few years will accelerate even faster. And then to all kind of other non-gas technologies like heat pumps and just improved efficiency generally.
Thanks. Anne-Sophie, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I fully agree with Robin that, we might see a completely different outlook for natural gas and LNG demand in Asia. And critically, I am a little bit worried about what is going to happen in Southeast Asia, which, individually the countries do not represent that much, but when you are adding them all up, then suddenly, the volumes do matter. I would have a slightly different perspective than Robin on the 2025 date. So I think for me, when you are an LNG producer or when you are off-taking LNG, you are making money, a lot of money right now. So for anybody who has a project under construction right now, it's really important to get this project starting as soon as possible. If you can start early 2025 or maybe 2024, this maybe 1 year or few months difference is going to allow you to make a lot of money because you are still going to arrive into a tight market. As soon as basically, as I call it, the cavalry arrives, with Qatar and the other US LNG projects, then the prices are going to decrease relatively substantially. And then, you are not going, you are no longer going to be in this fantastic period of high prices. Fantastic, but with a lot of long-term consequences because as I worry, this may actually destroy what we called 10 years ago the golden age of gas.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're getting into really our last few minutes here. So I just want to put everybody on the spot maybe one last time and ask if you could give us to close, for 2023, if there's one particular supply side development that you're particularly focused on going into next year, what is it? What's the particular interest there? Jamie, maybe I can start with you, and then we can go to Anne-Sophie and Robin, unless there's an alternative anyone has. But we've talked a lot about longer term, so I think just heading into 2023 would be a good place to stop.
Sure. Yeah. So clearly one of the big themes of today's discussion has been that we're not going to see big volumes coming online until 25, let's say, maybe a bit earlier. As Sophie was saying, there's clearly an incentive to do that, although supply chain problems are going to hold up a lot of the work as well. So there's possible slippage a little bit further as well. But if we're looking at possible relatively near-term additional incremental supplies, one region that myself and Robin have touched on is Iraqi Kurdistan. Let's see if we can, if possibly this new government in Iraq that has finally been arrived at can herald an end to the rocket attacks that have been plaguing gas developments in Kurdistan on the Corbeau gas field there. Expansion of that was meant to be early 2023, but work has been stopped for, going on 3-4 months now. So clearly that's not going to be happening in Q1, but if that can come online in the second half of 2023, a gas pipeline link up to Turkey's grid can be fast-tracked. We could theoretically start seeing small volumes, even if it in the near term there, with the second phase development at Qamar, which is really the one that's going to be slated for export markets. So, yeah, that's where I would want to be watching out for is can we finally see a breakthrough in gas exports from Kurdistan?
Great. That's a good point, and I think all the more reason for a lot of the audience to check out that new paper on Iraqi Kurdistan as well. And Sophie, in 2023, what are you looking at?
I'm looking at two things. The first one is whether Arctic LNG 2 is going to come online or not, because, I mean, no matter where this LNG is going, I mean, this is still potentially substantial amount of LNG for the global LNG market. And actually, I mean, we should, be happy if that LNG moves forward. I know that in terms of revenues and balances, this is not great, but yeah, I mean, we need more LNG right now. And by the way, Europe continues to get a lot of Russian LNG, but nobody's talking about that. And the second one is actually a very small project, which is in Congo, which is a fast-track LNG. It's a small thing. It's very small. But, if that actually moves forward and starts in 2023, that will be one of the fastest LNG projects that we have ever seen. And it's small, but, that would be a good sign, especially if that could multiply over the next coming years.
Great. And Robin, you have the last word.
Yeah, what I'm looking for, we didn't mention it too much. We did talk about decarbonisation, but of course we have COP27 climate conference in Egypt, and we have COP28 in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, actually, in the UAE, in November next year. So the talk around these, what comes out of them, they're big UN events and so on. Maybe the talk is not so important. I think what is important and interesting is the commitments that come out, because countries feel pushed to demonstrate something by holding these events. And Egypt has announced an incredible number of new hydrogen projects in the run-up to COP27. Who knows how many of them will happen, but the pace of announcements is kind of remarkable. And I think we'll see some big announcements from the UAE too. We've already had a significant tightening of the UAE's 2030 carbon reduction commitments and a bit more specificity. That's really one to watch. And will other regional countries follow Egypt and the UAE in setting net zero carbon goals or in defining their goals a bit more clearly and in actually making some progress on some of these big decarbonisation things like the hydrogen projects, like the carbon capture projects, the renewable projects. All of these things are gaining momentum, and they're starting to spread outside the 3 or 4 kind of regional leaders to further countries.
Thank you, Robin. Well, that's excellent. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, and I can say that I've definitely learned a lot as well. So I hope everybody in the audience has. And with that, I will turn it back to our hosts.
Thank you very much, Colby. I also want to thank Anne-Sophie, Robin, and Jamie for an excellent economic analysis of gas markets. Also to thank our earlier panel, Michael Cohen, Christoph Ruhl, Herman Wang, and Kate Durian, looking at oil markets. This wraps up today's first 2 sessions of the 2022 Petro Diplomacy Conference. Tomorrow at 9:30 Eastern Time, we're going to add another big layer of complexity on top of all of the economic analysis we've heard today. We're going to bring in geopolitics, we're going to bring in national politics, and try to figure out the impact of political decision-making, political thinking, local elections on top of, and the impact on all that we've talked about today. Tomorrow morning, 9:30 Eastern Time, OPEC Plus and the impact on U.S. Gulf relations. I think it'll be a very interesting session to add to what we have heard today. We hope you'll all join us, and until tomorrow, signing off from here in Washington from AGSIW. See you tomorrow.